Good evening. Welcome to the Words Festival and tonight's reading and conversation with the poets Liz Howard and Canisia Lubrin. My name is Laurie Graham. I am a poet and the publisher of Brick Magazine, and I come to you tonight from Nagojawinong, aka Peterborough, Ontario, the place at the end of the rapids in Mississauga, Anishinaabe territory in the Otonabee River watershed. I acknowledge and give love and thanks to this territory, and I acknowledge and give my love and thanks to the territory from which Words Fest derives, to the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, the Napaawak, and Arawandaaran nations, and I also send love and thanks to Deshken Zibi. I'm so glad you're all here this evening, for tonight we are going to hear from two poets at the forefront whose work has had and is having a profound impact on Canadian letters. We'll listen to them read from their latest books, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion, and you are encouraged to take part in that discussion. I will be minding the Q&A box, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. Many of you will be familiar with that Q&A box. If you have questions for Canisia and Liz, please type your questions there. I can't guarantee we'll get to all of them, but we're going to try to at least get to a few. You'll also see closed captioning at the bottom of the screen, the words live transcript, the box to the very right. Click on that if you could benefit from a live transcription of this event this evening. And also please feel to make use of the chat function at the bottom of your screen to say hello, tell us where you're from, deliver your exclamations, your virtual applause this evening. This is the place where you can interact with other audience members. And please note that due to my own fallibility, I might not be able to mind the chat quite so closely. So if you type your questions to the authors there, I may not see them, but please talk amongst yourselves, tell us where you're from, etc. So let's get right to it. Canisia Lubrin is a writer, editor, and teacher. Her most recent poetry collection, The Dysgraphics, won the Wyndham Campbell Prize, the OCM Bocas Prize for Caribbean Literature, the Griffin Poetry Prize, the Derek Walcott Prize for Poetry, and it was a finalist for a whole host of others, including the Governor General's Literary Award for Poetry and the Trillium Book Award for Poetry. Her debut collection, Voodoo Hypothesis, was named a CBC Best Poetry Book and a finalist for the Raymond Souster Award. Lubrin is the poetry editor at McCullough and Stewart and has an MFA from the University of Guelph, where she is assistant professor of creative writing. Welcome to you, Canisia.
Laurie, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here to share some lines, some music, some thought with the poetry folks in London at WordFest, with Liz, my compatriot. And I would like to thank Josh and Tom and everyone else involved in making this evening something real. I will share a few lines from the Dysgraphist, from which I'm reading from the territories of the Lake Scugog First Nations. Gratefully. I will read from the third act of the book, Anti-Episteme. Which is a series of dream and returns. Return number 6. What about merely the roads then, or the epiphanic hour after them? The newest version of myself, fit to name you a thing. And though I think about you, I'm shaken. I set us a meaning while you weren't looking. I study the language that would call us home. The same one to calm the baby. Here, let me arise singing if that would soothe you. That all I am is evidenced, or else for who? like me, to stand in red sap, dripping into nib, the match. Dream number 7. An amateur is in the streets. To the amateur, we are lost and startled. To the amateur, all the people in the streets are dancing, are only alive when not dragged. The sweat of the amateur in the streets, with her clipboard, with her hips tight against a banner, with the words in bold red, nothing is better than peace. Return number 8. Still warm in this waterhole warning crowds, away from narrow and tight jeans and no problem, man. This place where worn trousers go suddenly red with dirt, mud manganese, speedboats now cutting through spastic fog, pushing from a riverbank's newly burning sideburn in Kikuyu. Still, suddenly coat, suddenly Yemen, and suddenly behind me, a leaping year. Abruptly, the maze leveling Lakai, Gabon, Burundi, Bujudara, Congo, here. Hold this, and my problem, and dream. Dream number 9. Me here house belong a first. I've entered the motherland, and I feel orphaned. While it is dark, I'm on standby. I forage for breath, meaning new D is the same old African D I picture myself, now leaving again, corroded and in flight, rusted, late with sparks brushing from my tongue. This coming home wilder in Creole, left in a roundabout, the Mombasa of whose dreams, and with Kiswahili precautioning a clear Creole, lifting the tongue from whitewashed mud houses. What have I learned of Ina Lingua from women uneager to peddle this, all this back for $1 American, forgetting this same augury? I have a problem with dream. Return number 10. Fear is an infection in a refugee camp. The Indian poet brings and greetings from her students, at least the ones she remembers, stumbling out the rear of her mind. As I remember a fence I was sure I'd never seen, fondly weaving dreams in God's own country. A vital goodness in that world she believes. And in spite of all the hard things, I won't bother listing now. No, a campaign ain't worth shit unless shit stirs the mo better. Plimeye, and what for? And for whose sake do I feel only anger? Sweet jolts, disappointment gone from me and hope ran cold. Say nothing of art, nothing of the variable logs. Again here, I have this problem with dream. Dream number 11. They couldn't have gone anywhere if they wanted. If I wanted, I could collate someone out of an onion, cutting their tears from settler banter, speaking involuntarily the names of poems, memes, some dramatic dogma they hope will soon recognize, slowly, at their backs. A sapling gives in to gravity, though maybe she's right. The world is this grace, or victory that ought not to unburden me, because all we have done is little good. And that toppling sapling I can't quite stop imagining. Its slash of land, a seed crossing water below, a burial for how long? this problem I have with dream. Return number 12. I sit in a boat and be cold. Fouette se manier bête, yet in this tent I let you sicken me with song. I'm in you, poet from Cyprus, to insist in these last days you keep your fire, a mod guitar, the impossible early languages we unearthed, how they took our voices and left us, still encamped, maybe. Our hope is in the poet from Finland, reseeding this Cayman in its ripped 2018, and what else to do? Still, to be reminded of this unsleeping word in this unsleeping country, north of the Tropic of Cancer, or what God's birthplace, and of course, this, such a place would be a transit town gathering us up, the embers of failed revolutions, and so, what is happening now, poet? Do you make a fine noise of hour and quiet in Hebrew? Make them all listen and rethink? Do the dogs mind lies? In Española, do they mind the black mouth weeping? Speaking then, we believe they bark in Swahili, so no credit here. I have this problem dream. Dream number 13. Like a stack of worn shirts piled before us, sigh in Polish, or the fights that await us 15 houses hence in Arabic. How unchanged, the work of anything into shape, a shard, sharp with hope. A look can draw the missing piece into masterpiece, whole, cree it not, draw these earths we refuse, prepare for them a whole existence hostile to the shopping cart, yet unrealized future. The spider means to understand this war, and do I know what was then has come again? Do I know of the thing that could be wrong again, the thing that slows and slows again, that hits and hits again, sickness? And my problem with dream. Return number 14. How many ways can you disappear a people? Dignity by dignity, slant word by slant word. Who turn grave, grave by the curve and measure of graves, after typhoons, cyclones, the mounting electro wastelands by the freshwater, and wrath of tumors as bright brush on the forehead, or covering over knees, the work of minutes grating against millions in flooded cities. What garments I wrap this zealous hand in, steering east all through the night. Come the morning, I will not be long enough and patient enough to level a quick word, a way out. How many ways can you empty a people? Hope by hope. I do not venerate men at all. I have a problem with dream. Dream number 15. Draw me the waking up, the gray hardness of the mind pressed into the early hours of another house, another law, and fog, a brown century before something like sunlight. What kind of person dreams while the world petrifies, its pieces sharp and shamed for red dirt and hard morning, simple. Things are hard, you harden up, and the softness that lets you give one thing, lets you walk off feeling some small need to be not much for symbols anymore, careful to have a problem with dream. Return number 16. Let no Westerners back into this camp, lucid with insurrection, limp, still in their childhood. Refuge is a guilt Is a helmet still a helmet? Is a library overfull with dense descriptions of coming and going? If to agree that this sword of battered words is sharper paired with helmet, paired with boot, helmet, only half full of a shared language, logging the tides half emptied of reefs, and again the pilfered logs, the madness of royal seals, patriotic unthinking, records lead-born and hand-worn, if to stay assemble, to which year to return, having been emptied of the need to dream, who will stay here long enough to exit with me out of them long days, for as long as it go take, I am asking now, and in spite of my problem with dream. Dream number 17. Let them say I have seen the long days. I have seen them rising from the huts as smoke. I have seen them as forests turn brown and flat for remembering themselves, wishing that we had not factored into their algorithms. And now I have seen the long days arrive with things I do not know. Nothing too much if I'm lonely. Nothing too little if I'm able to drain the desert and leave the ocean empty, long enough for a new beginning. Why have the long days arrived far from the valley of the kings? Still, with the machinery bearing the insignia of ruling governments. What monotonous pride if they say I drank milk they bought with a fraction of our natural selection. Believe them such reckless regard for a few hours, over the long reach of us into some hot place, a future perhaps. I have seen us with their machinery and watched them arrive, knowing our desires and leaving with our deaths. And now you have too. Where is your problem with dream? Return number 18. For as long as we've had dreams, we've had rivers. For as long as we've had fears, we've been rivers. We've been legions held ransom for our thirst. We wake up ready to stay awake to the rush wild innermost that time can offer us, to the weak old boats that have come to pick us up with rumors of our innocence, and sad strong songs that pile up before the rain, the good pungency of wind through the corn, and once full creeks, grabbed guns, the vroom vroom of a crushed mood, coming back as you and only you, please, you without helmet, full of song, full of wine, and just as you with sword, heavy with the ordination of mud, worn out of dream, to take up my request, to lower the blood pressure, keep alive a word for this problem and this dream. Thank you.
Thank you, Kinesia. Beautiful. Next is Liz Howard. Liz Howard's debut collection, Infinite Citizen of the Shaking Tent, won the Griffin Poetry Prize, was shortlisted for the Governor General's Award for Poetry, and was named a Globe and Mail Top 100 book. Her second book, Letters in a Bruised Cosmos, came out this past June with McClelland and Stewart. Howard received an honors Bachelor of Science with high distinction from the University of Toronto, an MFA in creative writing from the University of Guelph. She is of mixed settler and Anishinaabe heritage. Born and raised on Treaty 9 territory in Northern Ontario, she currently lives in Toronto. Welcome to you, Liz.
Hello. Thank you so much, Lori. And thank you to Josh for the invitation to be here today. And it's such a pleasure. I wish that we could all be in Congress together in person. That this is very lovely, and it's such a pleasure and an honor also to be reading with Kinesia, who was in the same cohort as me in the creative writing MFA that we both did. So I don't know, it's really great to see. I don't know how far we come And we're still, you know, involved in this curious and beautiful madness, which is poetry. Anyway, I will read for you from my book, Letters in a Bruised Cosmos. Probability cloud. I'm just going to time myself here. Here we go. Probability cloud. The universe broadcasts its lifespan in radiant heat. I need to believe my account will outpace its ending. Technical oracle, a feed that repeats itself, a reckoning. What I felt was complete disorientation, but the sky is more than a map to read into the end and origin of everything. There is a guilt that folds into me like humanity, a darkness in the signal. A mark science confides is evidence of another universe, the collision of an afterbirth. If I continue, can I hold the body beyond its contact traces of violation and intimacy? The palimpsest furniture of our specious present, a succession of excess. I am here, after all, for decadence and silence. See this decadence, a bloom beneath the skin of my invitation, not truth, but surface, the hole in the sky. Superposition. I've gone too far, and now I'm over my head in the river. Its rapids stained red with tannins, leached from the decay of wood and other plant matter, lilies and reeds. Kabaskwashishing, river of weeds, bifurcating its way north to the Arctic. I'm 6 and unable to swim, my small limbs pushing against the cross current, feet waterlogged in the silt. The overcast sun seems to make the water hum its color, something cousin to blood. In the developing mind, to think a thing is to make it happen. This is the end, then, here below the surface. A voice shooting through me like a warning. A dark closing in with the storm clouds when another swimmer grabs hold of me and drags me back up to the light. Settler Anishinaabe Noli Turbare. Beauty is my irreparable eye, and today I became geometric, a faux linear figure that distills a skipped trace of first principles, in a whiteout of Atlantic snow, banging stars into the ephemeral vein of Euclid, while rows of lavender circuits, all porous, surrounded me. I genuflected before the hospital parking lot of my father's jaundice, for I am a good daughter of the colony which begot the immortal heart of the markets. Resources nursed all young bucks of the florets, a liquidity I should service or else receive a lesser dessert. With my smudge cleanse at the ready, I find myself dispensing with the usual future haunt of resilience. A survival signaling my relationship to time, or am I out of it entirely? Come Polygon and I circumvent the disaster. Do not disturb my circles. Holy I went, holy all around my head, the holy I am went careening down the back stairs of this low-rise rental, striated by the pinnacle light of this city that has my blood pooled purple at the center of its gravity. You can scan the ground from overhead for death pits. I read this on the internet when I was dehydrated, lonely, and afraid. Office plants became the broadleaf repositories for my cognition's faded hurt. I've gone and been abominable. A column extended from the top of my head into heaven, at the edges of my system, an Anishinaabeg or Indo-European projection of words my nerves could translate into the crawl space of animal magnetism. White pine verticals send us up as a stomach pumped by filial love. Oh, inconsequent curb of my street, I refuse to kneel. This day like any other, plush pockets of rust about another, falsehood of water, a creek that pleats. I've gone and got a blister. That summer, a black bear's muzzle got coated in shellac from the aerosol can she bit through on my mother's porch at the edge of the forest. 4 generations ago, my great-grandmother said, "Don't ever shoot a black bear. They are my people. Makwa from the North Shore." Before I continue to speak more than this mortuary sunrise, where I'm only just alive. Bonjour, I mean, hello, today is over. Superposition. Having surfaced, could it be said I came into self-consciousness again through an act of purging? Accessory to the second mind, housed in the middle, a neural web around the viscera, gut feelings and heartbreak. I'm handed some paper towels and a bottle of Windex and told to clean up after the half-wild dog that has been living in our back porch. As I open the door, sunlight catches in the bottle and projects a dancing sapphire blue back into the hallway. On the other side, the dog has pissed and defecated all over the floor. He comes to greet me, but the smell is making me retch, and I can't help but throw up onto the mess. The dog begins to lap up my sick, which makes the whole thing worse, and I retch again, accidentally vomiting on his flank, which he then bends his neck around to lick. It is in this moment, at the age of 7, I believe I had what psychoanalytic theorist Julia Kristeva has called an experience of abjection, a breakdown in the natural order of things, a separation between the self and an object of disgust that suggests death. Somehow my mind was lifted up to the ceiling, and I could see myself with total vulnerability. It wasn't just nausea that I felt in my stomach, but a true separation between myself and world, all its unpredictability I'd be tasked with weathering. 7 is the canonical age of reason, my grandmother instructed me. Now that I am cognitively responsible for my sins, I must confess them in order to be in communion with the divine and avoid hell or purgatory, the waiting room for souls. The confessional booth was at the back of the church, and I had to walk past all the pews of parishioners who watched me. The booth smelled of adult sweat, and a man sat on the other side of a little screen who would forgive me. I could never bring myself to say that at a dinner party, a father had performed a magic trick where he closed his hand around a small toy, and when he opened it again, it was gone. I asked if he could do the same to me. He laughed nervously and said he could try, but he might not be able to bring me back. I said that was okay. And from how his face fell, I could tell what I'd said was wrong. It was wrong to want to be a part of nothingness. Father, is it something dark in me that wants to be held so close I disappear permanently? Letter from Halifax. I just walked the street of my father. The street is called North. I paused in front of his white apartment building as the sun fed me from the west. There were 2 shopping carts chained together, one from the liquor store. My father turned empty bottles into full ones, into food and into rent. He pushed his cart across the city, gathering emptiness. I wonder if the North was the repository of his best intentions. He left when I was an infant. Powerless over drink, he ran, jumped the track, and erased himself from public record. He became a shadow I couldn't match. Every native man on the street, the unidentified dead in government databases, I searched their faces to see if they were a part of me. Would-be astronomer in his youth, I learned also to cast my gaze upwards. When I look at the Pleiades, I see 7 sisters who could hold me. In Anishinaabe cosmology, the constellation is known as Bagane Gijig, the hole in the sky, a portal between this world and spirit, where I go when I dream. And if anywhere, the place I will find him again. I'm trying to write this as I sit in a Tim Hortons, waiting to meet his common law spouse, who will give me some of his personal effects, when a man next to me asks, "What does this word mean?" pointing to a spot on the page of the Maclean's where the word rapport appears. I landed yesterday in Halifax. My aunt had called to say he was here in hospital with liver failure and in a coma. The doctors would give him 48 hours to come out of it. I had the thought, maybe, if I go to him, he'll wake up. My father's skin had yellowed, and the sclerae of his eyes, which were half open but clouded, a tear slid from the corner of his right eye to pass the bone of his indigenous cheek. This tear had not yet dried when they began to withdraw life support, machine by machine. What kept him breathing, what jerked his head back and expanded his chest with decreasing regularity, was the last to be withdrawn. A nurse said, "He is in the process of actively dying now." Actively dying. In the ancient Near East, a seer would look to the stars or livers of sheep for divination. What does the liver show or hold? Sparina, the Haruspex, foresaw the death of Caesar in the entrails of a sacrifice. Bagak, the cursed Anishinaabe skeleton who flies through the boreal forest, is said to consume the livers of his victims. Prometheus's punishment for stealing fire from the gods was to be chained to a rug and have his liver torn out daily by an eagle. Each night his liver would regenerate. 2 days have now passed. 2 days I have been in Halifax. 2 days since my father has passed from mystery into appearance, laying bare his totality on a deathbed. Distended, cirrhotic belly and ethereally beautiful face. He passed from unknowing into eternity as I watched the neon lines above him lie flat. I'm still watching. I still do not know what I know. A nor'easter now passing over me, spilling its moisture from the Atlantic, heavy rain that by midnight may turn to snow. What does it mean to actively die? Actively. I've been reading Knausgaard, who writes, quote, "For the heart, life is simple. It beats for as long as it can. Then it stops," unquote. Full stop, as in a period. As a period is a flat line when extended. I have been given my father's papers, his Polaroids, and a pocket watch that belonged to my great-grandfather. I have been given his ball cap that kept the maritime sun out of his eyes as he scavenged for bottles. The band of this hat has collected his scent, which is lemongrass, earth, and discount smoke. I have been given his small tools, cologne, nail clippers, a water canister, a small plastic box of razors, a picture of me as a baby, a drawing of electrical currents, a knife. I'm here wedged within 3 nor'easters. The first fell after he died. The jaundice, the eyes that are mine, the snow a whiteout of every street. The third will come Tuesday and cover Halifax in a foot of lace. Today I bought Ocean by Sue Goyette, a black dress and a pair of tights. Today I ate berries and drank black coffee. Today I felt the harbor folding in. The sphere flinched in my portal vein. Today I woke up late. This evening I looked up at the constellation Orion. Bibuni Kionani, the winter maker. Tomorrow I will see my father's body for the last time. Tuesday he will become ash actively. And I will close with one more that I don't usually read. Hopefully it won't go on. Maybe that one's too long. I think we're okay for time. Brain mapping. I might sit in a chair and watch as a stranger's brain appears on the screen, slice by slice. I could plot a correlate of thoughts. Still, I will never know you, only myself in relation. A rape in every generation of my line within the time of photography. A heritable loom of methylated DNA. How to speak this quiet balance that has separated me from history. Have I made myself accessible enough? There is a real power in the semi-permeable, danger of the underbelly exposed, tripwires of any tree rooting itself to the ground in the forest. I would often trip where the roots surfaced in partial relief against the pine needles. Smelling of sifted blood and full summer, iron oxides, ochre. Now I paint my body with Sephora. Exhaustion is a hall of waiting. I think because I am a feeling thing, a thing inside entropy. Neural effigy, what is it to be found innocent, or at least not guilty? With my health in my hand, at the end of this inverted hospital, I make the sign of the cross over the lack of applause. I set out in my work dress into the back seat of a strange man's car. A beautiful day in an accent I can't place. The worn spillage of North York goes on in burnt umber-colored brickwork, and I have myself become a stranger. When I enter the hospital, I see Kafka's face. He stares out at me from a silkscreen in Warhol's 10 Portraits of Jews of the 20th Century series gifted by a community member. Sometimes the lobby is filled with the smell of frankincense and the sound of women singing in Hebrew. Many of the eldest elderly came here as children after the war, survivors. This is a place of final refuge and a place where I assist with research into the cognitive mechanisms of the living human brain. The walls of the upper floors of the research wing feature work by Inuit and Native American artists. On Fridays after lab meetings, I will stare into the eyes of a man's portrait, an unnamed warrior who resembles my great-grandfather. My great-grandfather fought in the First World War. I was able to get a PDF of his war records off of the genealogy site. He was shot in the back in France. The bullet just a few inches shy of his heart. I learned also his sons fought in the Second World War, and what they saw left them unable to speak of it. One uncle took what he couldn't say to the train that killed him. I scattered my father above those tracks. History is a sewing motion along a thin membrane. Pia mater, dura mater, tender mother, hard mother. Can I still learn to feel protected by what encloses me? I dreamt this morning of a worm near translucent, evacuated from a wound in my side, not unlike the last wound of Christ. And I thought, this is the howling worm who with his dark secret love would my life have destroyed. Because yesterday I obsessed over Blake's The Sick Rose, recited it 5 times, the 5 holy wounds, the invisible worm, that flies through the howling storm of Blake. And I thought, that worm itself is howling, a howling worm that rests in a bed of crimson joy. As a wound is a rose, flesh bloomed is belief. And I dreamt also of a poet who was a prophet. And I went with her and others to Coney Island, a place I've never been. And we climbed into the bucket seats of a ride to hear her speak about the motion of the stars, charmed quarks, how to distill reality into intention. And some women learned this secret and began to flip atomically, simultaneously, changing positions with each other. A man appeared on the fairground with a rifle and fired high caliber rounds at their faces, but almost instantaneous to the moment of impact, the danger would be rearranged as if nothing had happened, a reversal of physical change. Over and over again, my younger brother appeared as a small boy and caught a bullet to the forehead, and I only knew enough to heal this one wound in order to return him to the world. As a child, sometimes I would receive a flick to the center of my forehead, a flick to the skin above the skull bone that houses the frontal pole, a site in concert with other structures that is said to synthesize the present tense I experience as me. Brief habits, minor passions, ill-considered missives into the drain of days. Always it is like this. Thrumming to my own dark frequency, like a broken lark under a maple tree. All the night assembles my subject, all the night the shape of one's self. And what do you find there beyond the quiet and the dark? That I was to do away with all of it. It decided to remain. Reforge myself inside tomorrow's humidex, aslant and listless, answer the messages, order eggs and begin again. I must pursue the future, pulling dawn through the needle point of compass north. Make me the sort of animal who knows when to take cover. A shaking dress, my hide blazing in the territory of the truly sensei. Thank you so much.
Beautiful, Liz. Thank you. It was wonderful. Thank you both. Yes, virtual claps. I hope the chat, yeah, the chat's blowing up. I just want to sit and breathe for a minute after that, but I want to instead do my job, ask you first this question. I envision you both as poets, kind of plugging away in the upper atmosphere, expanding and in some cases exploding the capacities of words and of syntax to make their fullest and most embodied and most just and honest utterances. Another way to put this, I get the sense when I read your work or know in an intrinsic way that you have found the exact right way to say the thing that most needs to be said. And I guess I'm curious to know or to hear how this came to be. I'm curious to know your poetic origin stories. How did poetry find you? How did you find poetry? We could start maybe with you, Canisia. I heard you say in another interview that you at one time were calling your poems songs.
Thank you for the question, Liz. Thank you for that lovely reading. Yeah. Well, I don't separate poetry and song. But when I say that I used to call the things I wrote songs, what I'm trying to perhaps expose is in the beginning, my reluctance to admit that what I really was about is poetry, because of the responsibility that that I found in it, the deep ethical responsibility that I found in it, that I felt somehow inadequate before. And so it seemed to me more agreeable to say that I was writing some songs. And also because I did commit them to music. But again, poetry is, poetry is music, is song in language. And what I think is important for me is that I am continually aware of what the thing demands that is before me, what the imagination that I am attempting to enter. And so when did I find poetry? I think poetry found me very early on. And that huge generosity that I found in poetry, in its meanings, in its manners, in its doubling and tripling of encounter with something that is both in the language and beyond the language. That was enchanting. It's still enchanting to me. And I think that is the kind of theremin that I'm trying to strike against each time that I come to the page. And so to find the right way to say what's most in need of saying, I think you nailed it. And with that question. And so I think, even before I knew or admitted that what I was doing was poetry, I was already there,
How about you, Liz?
Thank you. Thank you so much for, that's a truly rich, generous question. And Kinesia, I think you answered that very well, like in terms of, initially kind of feeling more an identification with song than written verse, because of this deep, as you said, this deep ethical responsibility to poetry, and taking up the weight of poetry, and also its generosity. In terms of like, what exactly are we trying to get at? Like a poetry, like an origin story, or like how it is that I came to poetry, just in general, or how it is that I write the way that I do.
I'm curious to know when it appeared to you, or when you understood that what you were doing was poetry, or when you understood that poetry is what you needed, anything along those lines.
Yeah. I started writing in general, keeping a journal and writing poetry when I was very young. Most of those poems, they were about, foxes and rabbits and bears and my cat and stuff like that. And they were mostly following some sort of like rhyme scheme. But I started reading. For whatever reason, I had an early interest in Shakespeare. And at the town library, the drama section was right beside the poetry section. And Shakespeare also like wrote some poetry. He wrote sonnets. And so I don't know, I drifted over to the poetry section and I just started reading. I think I took out like a volume of just like modern, I think it was like modern English verse or something like that. And then I started, sort of like reading through, the Canadian poetry section. So, I started reading, Irving Layton and Al Purdy, and I really loved Susan Musgrave and Phyllis Webb, and Susan Musgrave, essays, introduced me to Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton. And, by this time I was sort of, very moody and, goth, sort of teenager. And I loved it. I felt heard or seen or represented. And I started, writing a lot. I almost missed those days. All I did you know, in my free time. This is like before we had the internet, you know, even to, you know, sort of date myself a little bit. But I just spent all my time reading and scribbling in my journal. And then it really wasn't until like after I finished my undergraduate degree and started taking like poetry workshops and going to poetry readings that I really started, quote unquote, developing my voice. And I think, you know, like my most profound inheritance is the community, the incredible community that I had at that time. Like Margaret Christakis was one of my early teachers, and it exposed me to so many great like feminist voices. Yeah, that's about it, I think.
Like a snowball, you just
Yeah.
read and read and read, and then it's there with
Yeah.
you. Wonderful. I'll remind everyone here tonight that you can type your questions into the Q&A. I'm minding that box, and I'll try to pitch some of your questions at these two poets. A line of yours, Liz, has stayed in the recesses here as we're talking. Have I made myself accessible enough? I love the bite of that, and that kind of leads me to my next question about that word of making yourself accessible enough. I see both of your work kind of deliberately slipping outside of any frame that you could try to put around it, covering a huge amount of ground, really rich, really full of unexpectedness. With some traditions, you can kind of guess what the next word, the next line, the next rhyme is going to be, and that is absolutely not the case with both your work. So I'm wondering about, I guess the thing I should ask you about is your relationship to language. Has it in the two books you've both written, has that relationship altered at all or clarified? Do you know something about the way you use language on the page that you maybe didn't know one book ago, say?
Should I can, I don't know. I'm already unmuted. So, like, yeah, I think really in my first book, I was ambitious, you know, in terms of form, and just really letting language be, you know, as much of a high wire act as I could get it to as possible. You know, it's my first book. You know, I didn't expect that very many people would read it. You know, it's really something that I wrote, you know, for those closest to me in terms of craft and practice and, you know, intellectual interest. And so, but what did I have to prove? You know, I felt like complete freedom. With this second book, I of course try to be more in dialogue with a kind of readership. And with the first book, I got so much wonderful feedback and wonderful praise, for which I'm super grateful. But I also, you know, I'm since, you know, wanting to hear criticism, right? And one was that people felt, you know, the work was too difficult, too dense. Excuse me. They felt left out by it. You know, wasn't accessible enough. And I remember, like, with Kinesia and I were both in this amazing workshop with Dion Brandon. But I always remembered from one workshop that she said that she always sort of starts the next book in mind, you know, carrying forward some, you know, concerns or what have you from the previous book that she didn't quite feel that she had properly addressed or resolved. And I was always wondering, you know, about this question of intimacy and intimacy of address, and also and also maybe showing a bit more of myself, and like bringing a kind of raw, an emotional rawness to the work. So I've kind of, tried to explore that in this book. But apparently there are some people who still don't understand what I'm saying. So, wherever you go, there you are. Even in my most open confessional, possibilities, I'm still sort of maybe self-protectively, kind of semi-impenetrable or resistant, I suppose.
That's not how I would put it.
Okay, all right.
But, okay.
Well, has my relationship with language changed? I hope so. Certainly, I feel that the book is still very new to me, as much as I feel that I have exhausted the sound of my own voice reading from it, either in the last while. But the book still feels like a fresh imprint to me. And I think I'm always looking for the softest places in that imprint, where language remains this alive and moving and changing thing. And so perhaps some of the things I imagined language doing is still taking shape, and so when you say that that there's something in the work that's unpredictable, it is because I actually view language as an organism, as a kind of thing that is not static, that is not mechanizable, even though it is accepting of the ways that we try to mold and shape it, and so I'm always looking for what measure can hold the thing that I think and feel and imagine in language. So logically, I suppose what I'm always looking for are the spaces and the breaths that can allow the kind of muscularity that I have in language, that sort of angular physicality that I have in language, that things are always turning and grinding and breaking, to find the softest parts that still allows for me to move toward discovering more about language and more about what language can do. So yes, my relationship with language is changing on these practical levels, but I think on a philosophical level, I still think the same thing that I thought about language, maybe 5 or 10 years ago, even though the contours of that understanding, they're constantly shifting, but I still think that what I attempt to do in language is to apprehend something relational. It's a practice of being in relation, being alongside, and a place to find the spaces where I can I can view how horizontally full the world is, rather than the sort of vertical, hierarchical, top-downness, right? So I think a lot of what's unpredictable is just me getting out of the way of being too determinate. Yeah, that's it.
That makes me think of a line from your book, Kinesia. I is here breeding out of the dead land a definable origin. And that brings me to a question about maybe a continuation of the last question a little bit, about what echoes appear in your poetry. Is your poetic voice attempting to resemble or reflect or address the voices you've heard throughout your life? are you writing the stories of your families in a way that maybe you may not have heard them as such, but they kind of live in the work? I don't know if that's too tough a question, but what of your voice do you know is something that has been passed down to you?
Mm. Did you want me to answer, or Liz, you want to?
Whoever wants to start.
You can go right ahead.
Okay. I don't know that. I don't know what of that. I mean, I've said in other places that a lot of what I learn about the language that I still use, I learned from my grandmother. So there is this sense of the polyvocal, of the multiple registers and the multiple tonalities and the multiple voices. And the sort of spontaneity of collaborative art making. That's the space, the cultural space that I was born into and raised in. It gave me that sensibility. So I think maybe a part of what I'm leaving myself open to when I say I would like to not be too determinate is probably that's where that comes from, you know, because to me that's just it's more generative and it feels more real to me rather than something that might lean closer to something formulaic. And so I don't know that I am trying to voice the stories of my family per se, because for me, family exceeds the expected structure of the nuclear and the you know, that those kinds of things. I think there's something to the way that I think about family that exceeds those structures, and therefore, what is voiced in any kind of storying both honors and disrupts what one has come to expect of what something like family or story or voice can even mean, you know. And so I think what I have is the porous, you know, the really porous measure of storytelling that I did actually, yes, I did learn that from my my grandmother and people in the neighborhood who would participate in these kinds of community art making practices and so forth. And of course, then I met what we all did in the halls of academia and in school and such, right? So it's really a piecing together of all of those modes and measures. But what I'm doing, I think, is trying to exceed those bounds anyway.
Liz, what do you think?
Sorry, did you say something?
Yeah, I was just wondering what your response to that question
Okay.
of yeah, well, go ahead.
Voices?
Yeah.
I'll say, I have this great pet print of an artwork by an artist, I believe like this is from Manitoulin Island. And there's text on the print that says the voice of the land is in our language. And I feel that through my process of, trying to reconnect with, my birth father, my birth father's, Native family, that I've been trying to recover, a language that has, been systematically stripped from, members of our family. And also I've been privileged to hear stories, about, family members, who have passed and who I never had the opportunity to meet and hear their voices directly. Also something in terms of voice, like that I feel in some way like really informed how I write, and really sort of the strange musical quality that I seem to really, really value and pursue in my writing is that, when I was little, I was raised for, also, by my grandmother, my mother's mother, and she was very, very religious, very religious. And she would take me to sort of like prayer sessions, like of praying the rosary in the church. And because it's a town in northern Ontario, there's a very large francophone population, and so they would be like reciting, like Hail Marys and what have yous, working through the rosary beads, but they would alternate in between saying things in English and in French, as a chorus, all the English speakers together, and they were all women and older women, and their voices, were just fill like this massive church. It's the biggest structure in the town, and they would sort of echo and reverberate off of the walls, and there's all this like really intense sort of imagery and iconography, all around the church of crucifixion and the bleeding heart of the Virgin Mary. Something of that experience really stuck with me. But like other than that, like I grew up, like we didn't have any books in my house. I was really like the first in my family to graduate high school, even so. But there's something of, I think maybe my mother's quick wit and certainly her humor, and a sort of musicality and improvisational sort of storytelling, and imitations and joking and voices that she often does, I think comes through in my writing. And certainly, and certainly I've heard, many stories from her, about, going out hunting, various sort of complicated run-ins that she sort of had in, strange situations, and all of those contribute, to the sort of the plenitude of voice in my work, I would say.
Mhm. Wonderful. We've got a few questions here. I've got one from Soraya Gallant who says, is there one poem whose physical shape on the page is your favorite, or one which was the most difficult to achieve, and why? Preferably one of your own, Soraya says, but any poem will do. Is there one poem whose physical shape on the page is your favorite, or one which was the most difficult to achieve? And
I can go ahead. So I could just sort of think of something right off the top of my head. And it's certainly not, when you look at it, it's not it doesn't appear to be, a complicated shape. But in my first book, I have, this poem, Boreal Swing, which is a story that, I was told by my mother of, going out hunting with her father, my grandfather. And, after the moose has been sort of partially butchered and disemboweled, she was able to swing inside the moose, and my grandfather would push the moose, and it would be like a swing for her. That, to arrive at the poem as it appears published, and that went through probably 13 drafts or 13 versions. It was that little story was lost within all this other, business and weirdness that I was trying to do, because, I was at that time, I thought I was so punk rock, and I was trying to be like really resistant. I'm like, I can't just have straight narrative, it has to become, complicated in some way. But I came to realize that I could just have it on its own. And it's such I really had to privilege the image and privilege the story as something that I inherited. And basically what I did is, through playing around with it so much, it's all sort of centered on the page, and it almost kind of like has a a concrete poetic sense to it, where it almost looks like it approaches the shape of an inverted, you know, suspended moose body. Yes.
Yeah, that's a great poem, this Boreal Swing. Yeah. I don't know. You know, anytime someone throws the word favorite at me, I am immediately confused because I never know what to do with that word. so, so I don't know that any of this could be qualified as favorite. But in the Discgraphist, I made a number of experimentations with concrete poems. There's one, Dream Number Two, which is a poem about a mother and two sons, and it's in the shape of a kind of a pregnant bulge. And then there's an arrow going down the page into a kind of disintegration of words on the bottom, which is about which attempts a kind of visual representation of a metaphor breaking into meaning or disintegrating into meaning somehow. But there's also the suggestion of it getting, the sort of steadiness of an arrow and the piercingness of it, which puts me in mind of something Dion Brand says, that the metaphor is an aggressive attempt at clarity. It is not concerned with the reader's comfort, etc. And then there, but I think that Dream 41, the very last poem in that Dream and Return sequence, that section, is probably one that I can say something a little bit unordinary about, because it's like two poems in one. There's the parabola, the sine wave on there with very spare words and a kind of sea of white around it, which is that in that poem I'm referencing a river, and there's a kind of doubling and tripling of the signification of the sine wave, which is in the shape of a river bending, and then those sort of gaps that represent other things that I'm referencing in the poem, a mouth, a bend, etc. So there's that. I don't know about favorite though.
As soon as you say favorite, everything flies out of the head. That's what happens for me. What's your favorite? I have no favorites. I've got a question here from Julie Manel, who says, people often applaud both of you for writing poetry with a sense of urgency. What do you think it means to write with urgency?
Well, I feel like I just talked. Liz, you wanna?
Go ahead. Please go
ahead. Well, I mean, what else can urgency mean than for one to be available to what one feels is important, what one feels on the level of one's body in the world, and certainly beyond one's body in the world as well. So for me, writing with urgency is about attending to the things that are deeply important to me. And certainly in a sense, something that allows me to practice the kind of relationality that I feel in language, and the work that I think books can do in the world. I am not one of those cynical people, even though I can be very cynical about a lot. Ask any of my friends. But I am not one of those people who thinks that writing or literature is just some kind of fool's errand where people are just out there flailing about for no reason. I think books make a measurable impact and contribution in the world. I certainly know that my own history with books proves that. And look at very many places in the world where we can consider why books are being banned. Is it because they don't do anything? It's because it's we're just out here throwing paint in the wind, right? So there's something to me about living in the world with others, human and non-human, and forwarding a kind of literary imagination that allows for life to come to the fore of my thinking, in ways that might somehow reveal that, yes, I do have ideas, like I think things, I have a brain and I don't make apologies for it. And I have an ethics that I don't make apologies for either.
And well, yeah, Liz, you go ahead, Liz. What does it mean to write with urgency?
What does it mean to write with urgency?
Yeah, yeah. And
I have
guess
several different thoughts that are spreading out, sort of like the cortical fan of activation, like in my brain. One is in which, like, oh my gosh, I have an opportunity. Someone is listening, right? I better like hurry up and say what I need to say before they figure out that I'm not someone to be trusted with such a position, and I'm undeserving of it. Another thing is, I don't know, it might just be, I'm my nervous system is turned up to such a high pitch frequency, all of the time. I think that it comes through in my writing, and the writing that I do is as authentic, and it's just like a straight sort of, transmission of what my mental life is, right? And and to be able to feel like I can truly express myself, articulate something about my deep experience, which I know is not only mine. I know that I'm not alone in things that I've experienced, and how it is that I wish to express myself. But I find just articulation generally very difficult. This sort of format is probably this is kind of nightmarish, for me. But poetry isn't. So the urgency is, to have that through line and sort of like completed transmission, before like, I fall back into, this, dark hole that lives in the center of myself, right? And I can't like issue from it. And I think, a lot of the things that I write about in general are urgent topics, things that having to do with the environment, things having to do with identity, and sort of being of this process of like unassimilating or like decolonizing myself in my thinking, right? And also thinking of myself, like as a female body, under the strictures of patriarchy and of laws, and the legal system around sexual assault. I think these are all very, urgent and important things to be urgent about in writing, I guess. Yeah.
there are many, many urgencies. We've got, I know this is the most painful part, as Liz said, but we've got a couple more
Sorry.
here. I know the feeling. I know exactly what you're talking about. But these two questions, we got to ask these. We've got Lubrin Yanis asking Kinesia, as an immigrant, how has it been to be part of the CanLit canon?
Oh, well, I think canons are trouble generally. So, so I don't, this is not something that I am personally invested in the kind of practice of canon making. I'm not interested. But certainly the category of CanLit is similarly weird to me. I don't really think in those terms. I think I am involved in writing diaspora literature, Black diaspora literature, um, in the tradition of experimentalism or experimentation that allows me to attend to the history and the continuance of Black life and Black thought and Black being um, in the wake of the history of colonialism as the transatlantic slave trade. And those are the things that I am really pouring my energies and concerns into. So something as the enclosures of nation and nationhood don't really interest me at all, you know. So I don't know that I have a satisfactory answer for you. I know that I don't own any enclosures. That I am just part of a generative and expanding tradition of Black art and Black thinking, and that is the kind of art making that that's what I see, and that's what I that those are where my commitments are located.
Liz, can I ask you a similar question? Is your work, you were talking before about just unassimilating the process of doing that in poetry, and I wonder if you are in a similar way writing against any sort of nation statehood delineations to define a literature.
Yeah. I feel like I was more directly doing that sort of work, which I'm hoping to return to, is the work that I did with around this the song of Hiawatha by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, which was his quote unquote his Indian epic, loosely based on spurious anthropological research on the Southern Great Lakes, Ojibwe, and really like misappropriated all of these stories, and there's a lot of mistranslations and a lot of nonsense. It's embarrassing to read, which I think is why it's not really a part of like the conversation. And I was, and there's an argument to be made that it was an artwork, sort of espousing or part of sort of nation, kind of like literary nation building, like within the United States in the mid 1800s, and was very much espousing this idea of manifest destiny, of assimilation, of giving up the ways of like being on the land, and giving up language, and giving up cultural practice and religion, and submitting to the will and the goodwill of missionaries and capitalist interests that follow in their wake, right? So I was really working with the material nonsense of that whole poem, and really sort of messing with it and queering it in a variety of ways that were really interesting. So I'm hoping to take up, some of that project, but somehow with a focus on mental health. In South Dakota, there was, for a number of years in the early 20th century, an institution that was called the Hiawatha Asylum for Insane Indians. And it was like one of the very few, or the only one, or the first sort of like racially circumscribed like mental health facilities. And one can just imagine, right? I don't need to go into some of the things that that went on there, but I think there is and for that I will be sort of referencing who I'm not I don't feel like I'm well read enough to really speak on it, but drawing from some of like Frantz Fanon's work on how colonialism quite literally makes one a a mad subject, right? So I'm wanting to work with that, and sort of tear down, the colonialism, which I feel is kind of like a larger, it's a societal mental illness, I think, just like it's emissary capitalism, right? So giving myself a lot of work, I guess.
Yeah.
Definitely not being like overly ambitious, but
Is there any other way?
yeah.
Okay, we're coming close to the end of our time here. So there's one more question from Adriana Onita. If you could answer it in maybe a sentence or two. What do you love and admire about each other's work?
Well, I've been in love with Kinesia since we were in the Dion Brand's workshop, and in love with her work. And I have always felt a camaraderie, and I'm so glad that you called me your compatriot. I've always felt that sort of like convivial, like deeper than friendship, deeper than just like, yeah, deeper than just sort of like general affinity, or even just like intellectual, um, proclivities. I've always been like a great admirer of Kinesia's work. Yeah, since like the early days of reading each other and in the workshop through to her first incredible book, Voodoo Hypothesis, and then with this work, The Dysgraphis, which like I'm quite literally have no words for its capaciousness, its brilliance, its blows the top of my head off.
Well, uh, I don't think I should say anything else. After that, you think you just spoke for both of us in that one fell swoop. Thank you, Liz, for that. And yes, it is. It's a special kind of thing when um, poets can trace a certain growth and development alongside each other. And so certainly Liz and I were in the same cohort, as has been said 16 times tonight. And this is where I was first introduced to Liz's work. And I felt immediately that there was something utterly singular about her voice, not just its quality, but how far it can bend and stretch a gesture in language. That sort of deep well of meaning that Liz is able to pull into a phrase. It's quite a startling thing to have to see. And there is something, I knew that there was something in her work that was beyond explication, that one simply does not explain. So that kind of quality is utterly remarkable. And it's a thing that I hold up as a model. Even when I teach Liz's work as well. And it's always really interesting to see how the conversations move and throttle and even come to a standstill. I've had those kinds of things happen in when we bring Liz's work into conversation in a classroom. And so yes, there's this muscular thing that also brings a great deal of tenderness into the poem's places, and a lot of the stuff that I find generative reading Liz's work has a lot to do with just the way that she can handle metaphor and figurative language, So yes, thank you, Adriana, for that question.
And thank you both. This has been a really wonderful time. It was wonderful to hear you read your work. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Kinesia. Thank you, Josh, and everyone at Words Festival. And thank you to the audience for attending. Be sure to check out all the other Words Fest events. Take care. Have a good evening.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Laurie. Thank
Thank you all. Regrets.
you. Merci bien.